My uncle called me crying. The bank's foreclosing. I need $15,000 by tomorrow or we lose everything. I drove over with a cashier's check. As I handed it to him, I heard laughter from the backyard. His whole family was having a pool party. My cousin yelled, "Uncle Sucker came through again." I walked back to my car, stopped payment on the check, and drove away. The sheriff posted the foreclosure notice the next day. I, 34M, always thought family meant something. Growing up, my uncle was the guy who taught me how to throw a curveball, who slipped me $20 bills when my parents weren't looking, who made me believe that blood was thicker than water. That belief cost me more than money. It cost me my faith in the people I'd trusted my entire life. The call came on a Tuesday evening while I was reviewing quarterly reports for my consulting firm. My phone buzzed with my uncle's contact, and I almost let it go to voicemail. Work had been brutal lately, and I was behind on 3 different projects. But something made me answer. His voice was shaking when he spoke. He told me the bank was foreclosing on his house, that he needed $15,000 by tomorrow or his family would lose everything. The desperation in his voice was raw, genuine. He explained how his construction business had taken a hit during the economic downturn, how medical bills from his wife's surgery had drained their savings, how they'd fallen behind on mortgage payments despite his best efforts. I sat there listening to this man who'd been like a second father to me, hearing him break down over the phone. He apologized for asking, said he knew it was a lot of money, promised he'd pay me back as soon as things turned around. The shame in his voice was palpable. He mentioned how embarrassed he was to even make the call, how he'd exhausted every other option. Without hesitation, I told him I'd help. $15,000 wasn't pocket change, but I'd been fortunate in my career. My consulting business was doing well, and I had savings specifically set aside for emergencies. This felt like exactly the kind of emergency that money was meant for. I stayed up most of that night thinking about all the times my uncle had been there for me. When my parents divorced when I was 12, he'd taken me fishing every weekend for months, never once mentioning the obvious fact that I spent most of those trips crying instead of actually fishing. When I graduated college, he'd driven 8 hours to attend the ceremony because he said family milestones mattered. When I started my business, he'd been my first client, hiring me to handle his company's books even though I was green and probably overcharged him. The next morning, I drove to the bank before they opened. I waited in my car, watching the employees unlock the doors, checking my watch every few minutes. The moment they flipped the sign to open, I was inside requesting a cashier's check for $15,000. The teller asked if I was making a large purchase, and I told her I was helping family. She smiled and said that was nice, that not everyone would do that for relatives. The drive to my uncle's house took 45 minutes through suburban sprawl and winding country roads. I'd made this trip hundreds of times over the years, but today felt different. Today I was carrying a piece of paper that represented months of my work, my sacrifice, my belief that family took care of family. I pulled into his driveway and noticed several cars parked along the street. My uncle's pickup truck was there, along with my aunt's sedan, but there were at least 4 other vehicles I didn't recognize. I figured maybe relatives had come to offer support during this difficult time. The thought actually warmed me. Maybe the whole family was rallying around them. I knocked on the front door, and my uncle answered quickly, as if he'd been waiting by the window. His eyes were red-rimmed, and he looked like he hadn't slept. He thanked me profusely, saying he couldn't believe I'd come through for them, that I was saving his family's home. The gratitude in his voice seemed genuine, and for a moment, I felt good about what I was doing. He invited me inside, but I told him I couldn't stay long. I had client meetings that afternoon. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the cashier's check, folded neatly in half. As I handed it to him, explaining that it was made out for the full amount he'd requested, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Laughter. Loud, carefree laughter coming from the backyard. My uncle's face went pale as he realized I could hear it too. The sound was unmistakable, multiple people having a good time, the kind of laughter that comes from people without a care in the world. It was the sound of a party. I looked at my uncle, confusion written across my face. He started to say something about neighbors, about how sound carries, but his words trailed off as the laughter got louder. Then I heard music, pool splashing, the unmistakable sounds of people enjoying themselves. I told my uncle I thought I heard my cousin's voice and asked if he was here. My uncle's shoulders sagged, and he nodded reluctantly. He said the whole family had come over to support them during this difficult time, that they were just trying to keep spirits up. That's when I heard it clearly, my cousin's voice rising above the others. He was telling someone about how his uncle was such a sucker, how he always came through when they needed money, how easy it was to get him to open his wallet. The words hit me like a physical blow. My cousin continued, apparently unaware that his voice was carrying. He mentioned how they'd done this before, how I was always good for a few thousand here and there, how I never asked too many questions. He laughed about how gullible I was, how I believed every sob story they fed me. I stood there holding the cashier's check, feeling like the biggest fool who'd ever lived. My uncle wouldn't meet my eyes. He started to say something about how kids exaggerate, how my cousin didn't mean anything by it, but we both knew the truth was hanging in the air between us. I asked my uncle if the foreclosure was real. The question came out quieter than I'd intended, but the silence that followed was deafening. He finally admitted that yes, they were behind on payments, but not as far behind as he'd made it sound. He said they could have worked something out with the bank, that they weren't in immediate danger of losing the house. The betrayal cut deeper than I'd expected. This wasn't just about money. This was about trust, about family, about the fundamental belief that the people closest to you wouldn't deliberately deceive you. I thought about all the times I'd helped them over the years, all the small loans that had never been repaid, all the times I'd assumed they were just going through rough patches. I told my uncle I needed to think about this, that I wasn't comfortable with the situation. He started to panic, saying they really did need the money, that maybe my cousin had exaggerated, but they were still struggling. He reached for the check, but I pulled it back. I walked toward my car, my uncle following behind me, his voice getting more desperate with each step. He promised that my cousin would apologize, that they'd pay me back with interest, that this would never happen again. But his words felt hollow now, tainted by what I'd overheard. As I reached my car, I could see into the backyard through the side gate. There was indeed a pool party in full swing. My aunt was lounging on a float, drink in hand. My cousins were playing volleyball in the pool. There was a spread of food on tables, beer coolers, the works. This wasn't a family gathering to provide emotional support. This was a celebration. I got in my car and told my uncle I'd call him later. He stood in the driveway watching as I drove away, the cashier's check still in my possession. In my rearview mirror, I could see him standing there, probably trying to figure out how to explain to his family that their ATM had just driven away. The drive home gave me time to think, and the more I thought, the angrier I became. This wasn't just about today. This was about years of manipulation, years of being treated like a fool who was too trusting to see what was really happening. I thought about every time they'd called with an emergency, every time I dropped everything to help, every time I'd felt good about being the reliable family member. When I got home, I called my bank immediately. I explained that I needed to stop payment on a cashier's check, that there had been a change in circumstances. The representative told me that stopping payment on a cashier's check was unusual and would require a fee, but it could be done if I came in person with proper identification. I drove straight back to the bank. The same teller who'd helped me that morning looked surprised to see me again so soon. I explained that I needed to stop payment on the check I'd gotten earlier, and she processed the request without asking too many questions. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was paying a fee to prevent my own money from being stolen. That evening, my uncle called 6 times. I didn't answer. He left increasingly frantic voicemails, asking what was wrong, saying they needed to talk, promising that everything could be worked out. The desperation in his voice was real now, but it was too late. The next day, I went to work as usual, but I couldn't concentrate. Part of me wondered if I was being too harsh, if I should have given them a chance to explain. But every time I started to doubt myself, I remembered my cousin's laughter, his casual cruelty, the way he talked about me like I was nothing more than a source of easy money. My uncle called my office that afternoon. My assistant told him I was in meetings, which was true. I deliberately scheduled back-to-back appointments to avoid having to deal with the situation. He left a message saying the bank was expecting the payment, that they needed to resolve this immediately. I finally called him back that evening. I told him exactly what I'd heard, exactly how it had made me feel, and exactly why I'd stopped payment on the check. He tried to downplay it, saying my cousin was young and stupid, that he didn't really mean what he'd said. But I was done making excuses for them. I explained that I'd helped them numerous times over the years, that I'd never asked for anything in return except honesty, and that they'd violated that trust in the worst possible way. I told him that if they were really in financial trouble, they could work with the bank like millions of other Americans had to do. I wasn't going to be their personal bailout fund anymore. The conversation ended badly. My uncle accused me of abandoning family when they needed me most, of being petty and vindictive. He said I was throwing away years of family relationships over a misunderstanding. But it wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a revelation. Update 1. The foreclosure notice appeared on my uncle's front door exactly when the bank said it would. I didn't drive by to see it myself, but my cousin posted about it on social media, ranting about how the bank was evil and how family had let them down. He didn't mention the pool party or his comments about me being a sucker. Funny how that detail got left out of his sob story. My aunt called me a week later, crying, saying I was destroying their family over a misunderstanding. She claimed my cousin had been drinking and didn't mean what he'd said, that I was being unreasonable. I listened to her for about 5 minutes before I reminded her that she'd been floating in the pool with a cocktail while her husband was supposedly facing financial ruin. The hypocrisy was staggering. Word spread through the extended family quickly. Some relatives took their side, saying I should have been more forgiving, that family was supposed to stick together no matter what. Others quietly reached out to me, sharing their own stories about being taken advantage of by the same people. Apparently, I wasn't the only family ATM, just the most reliable one. My grandmother called me, disappointed that the family was falling apart over money. I tried to explain that it wasn't about the money itself, but about the lies, the manipulation, the complete lack of respect. She listened but didn't really understand. To her generation, family loyalty meant never questioning family members, even when they were clearly in the wrong. The house went into foreclosure proceedings, but it turned out my uncle had been more honest about their financial situation than I'd given him credit for. They really were in trouble, just not as immediate trouble as he'd claimed. They ended up working out a payment plan with the bank and kept the house, though they had to sell some assets and downsize their lifestyle significantly. Update 2. 6 months later, my uncle's construction business started picking up again. The economy was improving, and he was getting more contracts. He never called to apologize or to try to repair our relationship. Instead, I heard through other family members that he was telling people I'd abandoned them in their hour of need, that I'd let money come between family. My cousin graduated college that spring and got a job at a marketing firm. His social media was full of posts about new beginnings and leaving toxic people behind. I wasn't mentioned by name, but the timing and context made it clear who he was talking about. The irony of him calling me toxic after what he'd done wasn't lost on me. I ran into my aunt at a grocery store about 8 months after the incident. She saw me first and clearly considered avoiding me, but we ended up in the same checkout line. She made small talk about the weather and asked about my business, but neither of us mentioned the elephant in the room. As she was leaving, she said she hoped I was happy with how things had turned out. The passive aggression was thick enough to cut with a knife. The extended family dynamics shifted permanently. Holiday gatherings became awkward affairs where people had to choose sides or navigate carefully around the topic. Some family members stopped inviting both parties to avoid drama. Others picked a side and stuck with it. The family unity that had once been a source of pride became a casualty of their deception. I started being more careful about family financial requests. When my cousin on my mother's side asked for help with car repairs, I offered to pay the mechanic directly instead of giving him cash. When my sister needed help with her kids' school expenses, I paid the school directly. I wasn't going to stop helping family, but I was going to be smarter about it. Update 3. A year later, my uncle's business was thriving again. He'd landed a major contract with the city and was hiring additional crews. I heard he'd bought a new truck and was planning to expand into commercial projects. The financial crisis that had supposedly threatened their home was clearly in the past. My cousin got engaged to his college girlfriend and started planning a wedding. The engagement party was a big affair at a country club with over 100 guests. I wasn't invited, obviously, but I saw the photos on social media. It looked expensive. I wondered if they'd ask me to contribute to wedding costs, but that call never came. I started dating someone seriously for the first time in years. She knew about the family situation and was supportive of my decision to maintain boundaries. She pointed out that healthy relationships require mutual respect, and that family relationships shouldn't be exempt from that basic requirement. Having an outside perspective helped me realize that I'd been enabling their behavior for years. The family rift became permanent. We existed in the same extended family ecosystem, but in completely separate orbits. We'd nod politely at funerals and weddings, but never spoke directly. Other family members stopped trying to mediate or encourage reconciliation. Everyone accepted that this was the new normal. I invested the $15,000 I'd almost given away. It went into a diversified portfolio that performed well over the following years. Every time I checked the account balance, I was reminded that sometimes the best investment you can make is in your own self-respect. Looking back, I don't regret my decision. The money was never really the issue. It was about being treated with basic human decency by people who claimed to love me. They showed me who they really were, and I believed them. Sometimes the most expensive lessons are the ones that teach you the true value of the people in your life. The pool party laughter still echoes in my memory sometimes, but now it serves as a reminder rather than a wound. It reminds me to trust my instincts, to value honesty over harmony, and to remember that real family doesn't treat you like a fool just because they think they can get away with it. My uncle never did call me crying again.